Hi everyone, I'm Rohit. I'm one of the founding partners of the Quantum Hub. We are a public policy research and communications firm. Welcome to the second discussion in the series, Reshaping India's Data Landscape, the Data Protection Bill, being organized by TQH and Your Story Together. This is being done in the context of the PDP discussions that are happening. As you know, the Personal Data Protection Bill 2019 will have significant repercussions for many businesses, both from a data privacy and protection perspective and also possibly from a competition perspective. So as a joint parliamentary committee inches closer to finalizing its report on the bill, we thought that this would be a great time to discuss the latest developments and collect inputs from experts on how data should be regulated in India. And this is a series of discussions that we are doing. In the first discussion in the series, we had developed into the powers and functions of the Data Protection Authority. This is available on Your Stories YouTube. Today, we will be discussing the governance of non-personal data. Latest media report suggests that the JPC is deliberating whether NPD and personal data should be regulated by the same bill, and if the bill should be renamed as the Data Protection Bill 2021 instead of the Personal Data Protection Bill. So it is in this context that we're here today. I am joined by an eminent panel, Mr. Gaurav Gogoi, who is a member of parliament and also a member of JPC on the PDP bill. Subhashish Bhadra, who is a principal at the Umedyar Network India. Nadika Nadja, who is a consultant researcher with Hasgeek, and Srinidhi Srinivasan, who is a principal associate at Ikigai. Thank you so much, everyone, for taking the time to be here and to sort of discussing this with us. Now, before we begin, let me just give a very brief to our audience on how the thinking on NPD has evolved, so that everyone is on the same page before we get into the discussion. So in September 2019, the government had set up a committee of experts on the non-personal data governance framework, which had submitted its report in July 2020 and later a revised report in December. This is the report that has become the basis of all discussions on NPD. And this report provides a broad framework for regulation of NPD. In a nutshell, if I were to say it, the report proposes a NPD sharing architecture for public good, wherein non-personal data would be shared amongst and between private and public entities if it serves a public good purpose. And all of this is defined to some extent in the bill, while there are some gray areas. Now, data businesses are required to store metadata in a standardized format for the purposes of developing a central registry that can be queried. And this registry will essentially collate information on what or which data which business is kind of collecting. And then the actual data can be requested by what are called data trustees if this can be used to create a high value data set that is beneficial to the community at large. The report also sets up an NPD authority to regulate the entire framework. And in that manner, it kind of differentiates it from the regulation of personal data, which is coming under the Personal Data Protection Bill. So thus far, this report has formed the basis of most of our discussions on NPD. However, as I said, latest media reports suggest that the JPC is considering regulating both together to a broader data protection bill. Now, after having set this context, let me actually go to Mr. Gaurav Gogoi. Sir, since you are on the JPC and you're party to the discussions that have been happening in the committee, can you tell us a little bit about how the thinking on regulation of NPD has evolved? Of course, depending on whatever you are comfortable sharing with us.
Well, thanks, Rohit. As I said at the beginning, I'll try as much to share while keeping in mind the privileges of the committee, which means that we're not allowed to to publicize the discussions that have taken place in the committee. But broadly, let me say that we do understand that the government understands that this is a landmark step. And this is a step which is trying to fill a vacuum in our data governance. And because of this vacuum, I think it's leading to several other loopholes and obstacles in other forms of data governance. I think the fact that India does not have a data protection framework hampers our business in many other fields. So there is a sense that even though we understand that in its first iteration, no legal framework is perfect, but it is necessary to have, after having gone through so many rounds of consultations and inputs, it's necessary to have something in the field, in something in the operation, And then once we operationalize it, I'm sure both the Data Protection Authority, and there will be a continuous feedback loop from different domain experts and from the industry and from academia. And then what I perceive is a series of iterations over the years, which would help sharpen the implementation. I think there's going to be a strong role for the Data Protection Authority, and I feel that this is something that the Indian Data Protection Authority will have to address not only by itself, but it will also have to work now with its peers from across the world, from Europe, from Asia, from North America, to kind of reach a global best practices. So I'm really pushing and looking forward to the Indian DPA working with its European and Asian and North American counterparts. So therefore, what the industry can see is a common set of benchmarks and standards across the different geographies of the world. I understand the industries have become adjusted to the European, the GPDR standard, and therefore, while I'm not saying that the Indian standard needs to be similar, but if it is, there are some common principles behind our standards, then there would be less of an adjustment for bigger companies. It is more for the Indian companies that I sometimes worry about compliance costs, and therefore, we are thinking about how to minimize compliance costs, and therefore either focus on giving some transition period for the industry to understand, what are the requirements, as well as to put in as much information out there, make it as much transparent. So again, the compliance costs come down for the Indian industry. Largely, I mean, the third point I do want to make is that we do um, discuss and debate, and this is something that I think about myself. Is the future of democracy in the world and future of democratic values and principles in the Indian system as well. We want a state government, we want a state that protects the safety and security of its citizens and uses all information to better target programs. But we also want a active citizenry. We also want a active citizen that participates in the development of the nation, and is empowered with a sense of rights, is empowered with a sense of duties. So rather than have a subjugated citizenry, I would prefer an active citizenry which is aware of its rights and is empowered to exercise its rights. And therefore, there is also a balance of power between the state and the individual. But I think at this point, we're at a cusp. Many situations, whether that related to national security, better implementation of poverty alleviation programs, or even medical emergencies like COVID, have kind of upped the government's power when it comes to the kind of data it accesses or has to access. So sometimes we have to be careful that these emergencies do not relate to citizens giving up their power and their duties. And it is also about citizens being aware. I do perceive a lot of litigation in this regard coming up to with respect to data protection, largely because both the language of Indian law as well as the Puttaswamy judgment is a bit broad. Um, if I were to give an example of an Indian law with very broad terms, so public good, public order. Now these are very broad terms. You have no idea. There is no concept of what's a public good, public order. Similarly, with respect to the Puttaswamy judgment, necessity, proportionality, these are broad terms. So, these are good guidelines. Public order, necessity, proportionalities are good guidelines. But I think we will need, legal judgments to go through some of this in sharper detail. We would need future meetings of the standing committee and future parliamentary committees and discussions to again to sharpen some of the definitions so that it's common. Nonetheless, as I said, I think it's a very exciting time. It's been a long time for the committee with this bill, so there is also a sense of urgency that we need to have there. And again, the past experience, whether with the Right to Information or the Telecom Act or the Insolvency Act. So whether a bill is of financial nature, a legal nature, it will always go through iterations and amendments. So it's with that we hope that we can reach some form of consensus and have the bill out, especially in this session. So I think that's what I wanted to maybe possibly share, and I hope that's useful for the audience. I just wanted to give, as I said, not too much details, but give the sense of the broad direction and give a sense of the motivation and the drivers when it comes to the committee with respect to this bill. Thank you.
No, I'm saying it's really great to hear. Thank you so much for sharing that. I think it's also very good to hear that policymakers are cognizant of the fact that ultimately citizens' rights need to be protected, and there has to be an element of proportionality. Actually, in that context, I wanted to ask you. I'm sure the committee has had representations from civil society. Earlier, there was also the debate that personal data and non-personal data, it's also kind of a spectrum. It's sometimes there's granularity levels in which it's not so easy to classify data into binary components, and so therefore it may be difficult to delineate how the two are regulated. At the same time, there are also conversations saying that bringing everything together under one authority is also going to be maybe an overzealous attempt. What I also found interesting in your comment is you said that you would want to sort of look at global benchmarks to see that there is some semblance of uniformity as we kind of go across, right? But from what I also understand that internationally, and maybe Srinidhi, you can come here, is that so far, there's not been much done for regulation of NPD, right? It's the personal data that is been a focus. And when it comes to personal data and asking for that information, citizens' rights and everything come in. But how is the rest of the world thinking about non-personal data? And do you also think that, let's say the committee does decide to deal with the two together, is that a good idea, or what are some challenges?
Sure. Thanks so much, Rohit, and thanks, Mr. Gogoi, for your opening remarks and for sharing your thoughts on the law. Maybe, Rohit, I'll start with your second question on just the feasibility of having both under one framework. And I'll probably start with a very obvious statement that just personal data protection and non-personal data governance are both extremely complex subjects, as we've all come to discover, I think, in the past couple of years. Like Mr. Gogoi indicated also, I mean, there is always a scope for greater discussion, sharpening concepts, sharpening definitions, so some degree of sort of it being unsettled. And importantly, both of these concepts, personal data protection and NPD, have completely different objectives as I see it. The genesis of the personal data protection law and the PDP bill lies in privacy, with the Supreme Court's recognition of the fundamental right to privacy, informational privacy being a facet of that, input as Swami, and the government submission that they're working on a personal data protection law. So anything that affects user privacy, individual rights, be it security, children's privacy, cross-border data flows, anything that relates back to an individual, makes sense for it to be governed under this umbrella framework of the personal data protection law. The non-personal data governance framework has a very different objective, which is making existing data sets available for reuse by other organizations, by the government, by researchers, all of that. So that's greater data sharing and economic rationale. The two objectives might also be at odds often. Individual privacy and the community's sort of rights in enhanced data sharing. So given that these are such disparate goals, I wonder if there's a very real risk that if we were to combine the two, we'd end up doing a disservice to both objectives, because each of these also have significant administrative and operational challenges. With the personal data protection law, you have to set up a DPA. There are regulations that have to come in, just staffing the DPA, capacity constraints, all of that is going to be a massive exercise in itself. And we've seen this from other jurisdictions' experiences as well. There'll have to be regulations, codes of practice. The law is very principle-based, so a lot of the meat of implementation might come through the codes of practice. There has to be an enforcement machinery set up for adjudication of penalties, all of that. NPD as well calls for the current version of the law, the framework that the Gopalakrishnan committee suggested has its own sort of extensive structure, open access metadata directories, registration of data businesses, all of that. So again, sort of very significant structures in both sort of frameworks. Of course, administrative challenges shouldn't mean we don't regulate at all, but in this case, it's just that the discourse on these concepts is at very different stages, I would say. The PDP is at a far more mature stage of discussion. It's been around for 4 years, 2 rounds of consultation on the legal provisions. On NPD, the only real legal provision we've seen is clause 91, which doesn't provide a lot of sort of meat or indication of what it's going to do. PDP, there is some basic grounding, basic acceptance of privacy as the underlying objective, both in India and globally. And there is, one could say, a more urgent need for a data protection law. India is already considered a little late in sort of having a privacy law in place. Whereas NPD, there is still significant opposition to the conceptual framing. No consensus as to if and why there's a need to regulate NPD. What is the basis? Is it community rights? Is it market failure of data sharing, voluntary frameworks? Is it redistribution? So still up for debate. So no established framework so far. So given sort of these distinct stages and completely different objectives, it might be a little too much to sort of pack all of that within one law at this sort of mature stage of the PDP. I'll pause there. If you also want me to go into the international frameworks a little bit, happy to do that now or later.
Yeah, I think it's interesting you said that, the fact that there are different stages and there's a lot more debate that's already happened on PDP. And I think the frameworks are more clearer. Before we go ahead, it will be very useful if you can tell us if any other country has been thinking about it. Because, I think that also provides something to build on if there is something like that. Yeah.
Sure, yeah. I think in terms of scale and scope, India's proposed governance framework might be first of its kind. Of course, there have been conversations in different jurisdictions, the EU being one recent example with the Data Governance Act proposals. But the focus there is on reuse of public sector data and on boosting voluntary data sharing. So there are sort of removing the hurdles that companies might face in sharing data, like confidentiality restrictions or privacy or security concerns. There is the concept of data altruism, where organizations can voluntarily donate data. So not so much on sort of force sharing across the board. Some jurisdictions have also released guidelines like model contracts, data sharing agreements. Japan, I believe, has detailed guidelines discussing different types of data sharing contracts. Again, but this is also a voluntary framework. A couple of different sort of approaches, say in Australia, where there is a sector-specific requirement in the automotive sector for data sharing, which has its own sort of purposes and data. There's something in Finland again. So there are these pockets where data sharing has been discussed, but I would say the scope and this sort of, I don't know if it's also fair to classify it in the binary of mandatory versus voluntary. But I would say I think the scale and scope in India is way more than what we've seen in other jurisdictions.
Okay, that helps. And I think the Indian framework so far has been going towards the mandatory and sort of asking companies and businesses to share data. And it's not just about government sharing data, but also sort of asking them. So Subhashish, actually in that context, I wanted to sort of turn to you. At Umidiyar, you invest in and evaluate tech investments, and you also work on building open digital ecosystems to leverage the power of data and digital technologies for public good. What do you have to say? In fact, looking at the whole debate of NPD rests on the argument of that sharing of data will promote public good, right? And level the playing field between established tech companies and startups. I wanted to question the basic assumption. Do you think NPD sharing in the format that is being proposed will really enable that?
Thank you, Rohit. To answer your question very, right at the beginning, no, I do not think that in the form that it is currently being prescribed, it would work. But again, we must go back to one of the things that Mr. Gogoi said, which was that, look, this is a starting point and this will evolve. So we also shouldn't hold this first instrument, a policy instrument, to an extremely high standard, because it will always be insufficient. I think what's important for us to realize is really in what context are we having this conversation, because this is not happening in a vacuum. we are at a point in time where the pandemic has really imposed a lot of economic costs on the country and its citizens. And at the same time, it has also increased the pace of digitization a lot more. Therefore, this notion of potential over-regulation that Mr. Gogoi spoke about, I think is super important. If you look at some of the economic literature coming out of the US, it says that perhaps the US economy would have probably been 25% larger today if it hadn't been over-regulated since the 1980s. Now, of course, there is contrary evidence as well, which says in the long run, the costs of regulation are not as high and the benefits are much higher, etc. And so it's a contentious space. In that contentious space, what becomes important is to make sure we are not over-regulating in any way, because that is what harms the startup ecosystem and harms innovation. There are two ways to firstly think about it. The first way, and building on what Srinidhi said about these being just two very different objectives and therefore should be different regulations, different laws, and different enforcement mechanisms. Because as she rightly pointed out, you don't regulate because you want society to be in a certain way. You regulate because there's a market failure. Otherwise, we would all leave free markets to behave like themselves. In the case of data protection, we understand that the market failure is that there's asymmetric information, that the business knows a lot more than you do, etc. And therefore, you need to regulate to protect the consumer. In the case of non-personal data, what they're saying is that these data sets are not shared, it's leading to market concentration, etc., and therefore you need to regulate. So as Srinidhi said, one of them is a more economic and generative argument, one of them is a more rights-based and protective argument, and therefore need to be completely separate instruments. The more important thing, however, is if we look at the specific proposals that are in the current framework of the non-personal data, and of course this might change, right? What we might have is an omnibus legislation which says that the rules that are come out later will be the ones that will be setting the agenda. But if you look at some of the things that can be improved from a startup perspective and from an innovation perspective in this is firstly a lot of loose ends and ambiguities in the last public version of the Gopalakrishnan committee. So for example, there is this notion of public good that is pervasive through that instrument. But what is public good? Who defines public good? How do you enforce public good? Right? All of these questions have been left unaddressed. And just as Mr. Gogoi referred to this notion of public order, which has been interpreted in so many different ways, public good also could turn out to be one of those things that are interpreted and reinterpreted in many ways, creating a lot of ambiguity for the startup ecosystem. Secondly, there's this notion of duty of care, which is again pervasive through that entire document. But there's no specific guidelines. What does it mean for someone to exercise a duty of care towards his customer? So I think these kind of ambiguities need to be plugged. Otherwise, they create a lot of uncertainty for the startup ecosystem. Secondly, that the regulatory governance is really the big challenge that any startup faces. If you tell a startup that, hey, this is the law and we will consistently apply it, then I do not think too many of them will have a problem with almost any regulation. The problem comes in inconsistency. So how do you make sure that regulation is not inconsistent? I think there's a lot of literature that started out over the past few decades that tell us how do you design regulators well. And some of that has not yet been incorporated, certainly not in the non-personal data, but even in the last version of the PDP bill. So how can we improve the DPA as it is envisaged in the PDP bill? Firstly, mandating public consultations. This was there briefly in the TRAI document and the act that set it up, but it hasn't been in other regulators. And then you see that TRAI, for example, does a lot more public consultations. So it does about 50 to 60% public consultations compared to others like RBI and SEBI, which do much fewer. You make sure annual reports are filed, they're made public. There's a lot of rich data there because again, that is mandatory for US, UK regulators, but it hasn't been mandatory for our regulators. And thirdly, you have a separate judicial function. India is one of the handful of countries in which a judicial function, an executive function, and a legislative function are all combined and sitting within one entity. The judicial function needs to be through people who have judicial training. And therefore, there should be a separate judicial arm within the regulator, whichever is being set up, to make sure that there's less unpredictability for startups. So there's a lot more detail I can go into, but what I did want to say is that no matter where we arrive at all of this, I think what really becomes important is A, defining some of these clauses, B, making sure that public and experts have the forums to actually contribute to these discussions, And thirdly, that there should be transparency, because if you do not have transparency, then on what basis do you really talk about these things? And all three things put together, I think, are really the troika of good institutions. And what India needs at this point in its journey, where there is an economic crisis that we're just coming out of, is to make sure we don't overregulate, and therefore the troika of good institutions will ensure that we have the appropriate amount of regulation in the economy.
Great. Thank you, Subhashish. In fact, Subhashish, if I remember, I had read a piece that you had written where you basically said that, obviously the logic of NPD is coming from the positive externality bit that, businesses are not able to source adequate remuneration for the data set that they could make available. And that's where the need for the government to kind of step in comes in. But I think you also mentioned that, but do we really know how to solve that positive externality? I think one of the questions also is that even though we recognize there is a problem, is it likely to get solved that quickly? Do we understand how to fix it? And maybe that's a piece of work that needs additional research. In fact, in that context, Nadika, it would be great if you can tell us that when you spoke to your tech community during the survey, did you feel that any of the provisions that are in the NPD framework currently will actually help solve the problem that it has set out to solve?
The answer to that question, so just to give you a little bit of background to what we did when the Gopalakrishnan committee report first came out, as we went to the community of tech workers and tech organizations and saw how that will work out. And we had a couple of sessions, and then we did a large-scale interview, sort of a qualitative research with investors, with startup founders, with CTOs, and data protection officers, sort of a fairly wide sample of people who deal with data on a daily basis, and investors. And so that report we submitted to the COE. We had a further set of conversations that began with that report. And to answer your question, a large number of our respondents thought that the NPD framework, while sounding great in principle, will not probably work the way the committee was expecting it to work. And then there are significant drawbacks for smaller organizations. One of the comments that we heard was implementing NPD framework, implementing the way it was envisioned is detrimental to smaller communities, smaller organizations. It's a fairly technical process to do that. And then there was also questions about IP and how will that be protected and stuff like that. So there are deeper questions arising from the fact that IP may or may not be protected, and how do you regulate that in this environment. So the very short answer to that question is no. People weren't very sure how this will work out in the long run.
And Nadika, I had one question. So there's also a threshold that the NPD framework proposes, right? So how do you say that, I mean, would small businesses really be affected? As in, would their compliance increase, or would they be the beneficiaries?
So what happens in this scenario, for at least from what we've heard from our respondents, is that there are deep pockets involved on the other side of the threshold, and deep pockets always win. Smaller organizations will try and compete as much as they can, but then what happens is a deep pocket organization will just come in and take over the thing. And we've seen that with some e-commerce places, and we see that with retail e-commerce and stuff like that. We see organizations building some kind of IP, but then that gets taken over, or it gets obfuscated in other ways by larger organizations, and then everybody has to play catch up with that.
And this is to anybody who wants to kind of come in. What is it in your experience when you've been speaking to small, and Mr. Gogoi I'm sure the committee has heard from smaller businesses and smaller companies as well. In your experience and the conversations you've had, do you think that there is significant benefit that they're likely to have if data sharing was promoted?
Let me just say that the committee and the government are very mindful of the compliance costs for smaller companies. We are trying to look at ways of easing the compliance burden. We will look at different tools that can be available to the DPA in order to ease the compliance burden on smaller companies. But at the same time, just realize that there can't be a painless transition. There would be some amount of pain. It's just that how do you limit the pain? How do you ensure that most of the burden and most of the responsibilities are carried out by slightly bigger companies. So let us suffice to say that there is cognizance of the fact, and at the same time, when it comes to non-personal data, I think a lot would depend on what the DPA sets out in terms of codes of practice. I do see that this bill gives one set of clarity, but I would look forward to the composition of the DPA and then its subsequent release of codes of practice for that to gain some more clarity. And thirdly, I just would again kind of reiterate that, and that was some mentioned by one of the panelists as well, which is the reference to certainty. Now, if you're going to have a regulatory environment for data per se overall, with different set of frameworks operating, with different institutions operating, I think that leads to uncertainty. I think there's a history which is flowed right from the Puttaswamy judgment to this data protection bill, and we have had several round of consultations and iterations. So there is a knowledge that has come in this direction. There was a knowledge which would flow into the data protection authority. So I would rather hope, instead of having different bodies issuing directions which are at crossroads with each other, thereby an entity is a private entity will only get confused. An entity has to go to one regulator for personal data, another regulator for non-personal data. I don't think that's clear, and therefore I'm quite, as I said, there is a section 91 in the bill which says that it doesn't stop the DPA or the government from making other laws related to data. And I think that was, yeah. So after that, I just added that, clause 91 already states that government is free and welcome to frame other laws, and the
Right.
authorities free to frame other laws. And I think that was the mindset that, let laws come from one entity instead of multiple entity, especially laws related to data.
So Bashish, you have your hand raised. You wanted to sort of jump in.
Absolutely. So, Rohit, to your question of will this really help? I would say we don't know, right? And it's going to take us several years before finding out how and under what conditions does it actually work. Because if you look at the journey of the entire account aggregator system as well, right? We've been speaking about it for what, 3, 4, 5 years now. And it's only now that it seems we are on the verge of actually making that entire system work. So I think it's going to take a lot of time before it works. I don't think we should expect that on day one, this law comes out, rules come out, and then next day this entire ecosystem has been created. It's going to require a lot of experimentation, a lot of other kinds of technology, rules, etc., that are built. What is something that we can control at this point is the question, right? And at this point, we have to make sure that the institutional architecture we set up is one that helps us get towards that right answer, not that predicts the right answer on day one. And therefore, I would take us back to those questions of how do we make sure that the institutional architecture we are setting up has enough transparency, has enough consultativeness built into it from day one? Because sitting today, neither me nor a tech entrepreneur and even honorable members of parliament would really exactly know how this entire data economy is going to play out. So we just need to make sure that those institutional safeguards are in place, and we shouldn't worry so much on day one about whether this is actually going to work in the long run or not, because we will get to that point at some point.
No, I think that's a very fair point. But would you also, and before I come to Srinidhi, would you also say that while setting up the right institutions, it will be important to step slowly on the regulation, because once you over-regulate the kind of costs, it's become difficult to take it back. But when you incrementally sort of bring it in, it sort of allows space for organizations and businesses to sort of settle in. Is that something you would agree with?
Absolutely. And the way I would frame it, it has to be an outcomes-based regulation rather than a process-based regulation. As you rightly said, it is possible that we could actually place a lot of costs on making all of this work for large enterprises. As Nadika said, that it is very complex to set up these things in automated fashion. It will incur a lot of costs even for these larger enterprises. You want to make sure that those costs are worth the benefit. So I think to the extent that initially you want the regulation to be somewhat light touch, yes, that is important. At the same time, you want to make sure principles like transparency and consultativeness are baked into the parent legislation, because otherwise it provides too much discretion to the regulator, which in many cases we have seen leads to slightly higher uncertainty for regulated entities. So I think that is how we should approach this.
Fair point. And it also may help to see some of the outcomes before we sort of go completely head on with the regulation. Srinidhi, you wanted to come in?
Yeah, I think related point on the question that you had asked on sort of would startups actually benefit? Agree with a lot of what Subhashish said. So we'd also hosted this roundtable last year when the first version of the NPD report had come out, just to get perspectives of different startups, and some interesting takeaways there. Some of them were actually worried that it would make it difficult for them to sort of hold on to their data moats and hold on to their competitive advantage that they've built, because they might also qualify as data businesses if the threshold in the current framework is aligned with what significant data fiduciaries would be, which is volume of data processed. That could be massive in itself, even for startups. So if does that mean that large companies will also be able to access data from startups? That could defeat the purpose. And I guess just building on what Subhashish had said about creating frameworks that provide for transparency and consultation and perhaps more evidence gathering. It would be very useful to gather more evidence on precisely what kind of information startups might find useful in different sectors. I know there's some work being done around this by research organizations as well. What are the specific challenges that they face in accessing data? Is it challenges in negotiating data licensing agreements, or that companies with existing data sets also don't know how to make this available, how to ensure anonymization of data in a data set? If there were more marketplaces that are kind of maybe spearheaded by industry bodies, would that solve for this imbalance in and lack of sort of frameworks that allow for data sharing? So I think it might be useful to create even frameworks that support such data gathering, because I think one school of thought is that data is, anyone is free to collect data, but it's what you do with it. So beyond just the access, also focusing on what you do once you have that data, sort of making it meaningful, gleaning useful insights from that. If there could be pilots, I just sort of, again, if there are structures that are sort of working towards these objectives as well, perhaps that would be useful.
I'll go to Nadika. I want to also understand, so are there any actually use cases wherein, so two questions. Actually, one, is there, are there any examples of, as actually Srinidhi, you said that will startups, is that really the challenge? Is that the reason why they're not able to grow? The fact that they don't have access to data. In fact, there are also some commentators say that a lot of success of the big tech or the existing tech players depends on personalization, which actually comes from access to personal data rather than non-personal data. So even if I were to say make non-personal data available to startups, is that really the bottleneck that is holding them back? Is that going to allow them to sort of then compete? And are there actually any use cases wherein this has been tried, where maybe a data set was made available to an organization and it was able to build a product ground up that then sort of survived? Nadika, I'm not sure if there is anything that you've come across in your conversations with the community, but if there's anything you would want to share here.
Not really, as far as at least from the sample of people that we spoke to, there wasn't much in this aspect that making available certain data sets has helped other organizations or an existing, or the organization build a new product or a service or whatever it is, right? So we haven't had much, we haven't heard of that at all. But actually, I also want to pick up on something that both Subhashish and Srinidhi were speaking about in terms of having multiple regulatory frameworks to respond to. And I also want to point out that we are also now debating things like the IT rules that are coming in and going out, and a lot of these organizations will exist across all these data regulatory frameworks. And then what's going to happen to all that is also a question that there are concerns that emerging, organizations have to, for instance, telecom companies will have to respond to TRI, also to the IT rules will also have to respond to the NPDA or the DPA, whichever will eventually set up and regulate the idea of non-personal data. So there is a greater level of confusion of what compliance they'll have to fit into all of these, and therefore just making sure that this data is available is not going to help them. how they're going to use that data, how what sort of compliance they'll have to follow. I mean, for instance, if it's an organization that provides cloud telephony services, are they going to work as an intermediary under the IT rules, or are they going to be responding to TRI, and how will they use whatever data they're going to collect from the market, or from the data protection authority, whoever, or from the high value data sets that the framework is proposing. Things like these are questions that we've heard, and there's clearly no answer right now.
And Mr. Gohi, just coming to you, has there been a conversation around this? The fact that, the IT rules exist, is this likely to be subsumed? Is the PDP bill in whatever shape, and finally that it comes, is going to sort of take into account all of these other regulations that businesses have to comply with at the moment?
Well, no, I won't say in the context of the IT rules, but we do understand that the Data Protection Authority, in terms of composition, should be broader. It should have a diverse set of members in the authority. There are regulatory authorities in India which are very transparent in terms of its functioning, as well as taking inputs, as well as in its orders. And we do hope that the DPA is one of the more better known performing Indian regulators. They have whether there has been the example of TRI, there has been the example of SEBI, and again, there are institutions which will have to work across multiple regulators. A bank will have to work with with financial regulator as well as data regulator. I think that's pretty normal. But I'm just saying, within data, within the same domain, you should not be looking at two regulators. So for a mobile company, should not be looking at two mobile regulators, right? So the same when it comes to data. And the committee at the same point is cognizant of the fact that rules should flow from the DPA. The DPA should issue rules and directions which are global benchmarks. The DPA, it should be part of a global coalition, so that we offer common solutions to common issues. And at the same time, there is always this concern that can non-personal data be manipulated to identify someone? Can it be processed to identify someone? And therefore, again, in terms of privacy, it is binding on the government and binding on the DPA to protect the privacy of an individual. So, these are some of the thoughts that has come when it comes to the body. I personally am not in favor of government issuing, rules. I'd rather have the regulator issue rules, and a regulator that is trusted and is open and transparent. I'm also on the view that there should be oversight. The oversight needs to be both judicial, but much more importantly, legislative. I believe there's a stronger role for parliaments and parliamentarian committees, because as parliamentarians, we understand both the needs of the state and the environment in which it makes laws. But at the same time, as public representatives, we understand and are cognizant of the constitutional freedoms and responsibilities and rights of the citizen. So we are able to balance that much more. So I do hope that parliamentary committees in India will have the same powers, or if not the same, but closer, the powers which are closer to the committees of the British or the American parliaments. And I think that bodes well for our democracy as well, that the House representing the people of India is in oversight of the laws that are made for the people of India.
No, I think that's really great to hear. I think the way you've been thinking about the committee, at least, that sort of lends a lot of comfort to the fact that you're looking at things, a committee that is transparent, has a strong regulatory structure. Coming back to the angle on the NPD, I wanted to basically ask you that and you're probably right, that one regulatory entity is set up that is dealing with all kinds of data. On the NPD front, do you personally or the committee think that it may be better to go down the incentive route first before making it mandatory? And for instance, there are a couple of proposals that have been suggested. One, there's a set of people who've been saying that making anything mandatory means the least amount of compliance. Wherever possible, companies will give data, but it may not be in the format that is usable. Two, instead, should you incentivize the way Srinidhi was sort of suggesting internationally how it is being done? Should the government first start by making its own data completely available so that that sort of feeds into the government itself is collecting a lot of data, right, through digital ecosystems, that platforms it's being setting up. So can that be can that be made anonymized, etc.? And maybe those trends are shared first. And thirdly, what about things like data portability? That if you were to actually, instead of asking people to share data, mandate things like portability so that citizens or users can move their data from one business to another without too much of a hassle. Is that something that is going to give a greater spur to the ecosystem than asking for data to be shared and setting up a very elaborate structure to kind of enable that?
I think those are very good questions. I'm not sure if currently, these are questions that have to be answered by the DPA or by the committee. I think we can have a broader discussions, but there's also that there is so much you want to pack it in a bill as well. And you don't want the bill to get into codes of practices. You want the bill to have just overall
Right.
frameworks. As I said, there would be further codes, there would be further legislative, I would say further legal cases, which would give us more clarity. And at the same time, to the first question about incentives, the way I've studied and observed policy making, especially in India, by respective central and state governments, it hardly works on the principle of incentives. It hardly works on the principle of identifying who, identifying the right set of incentives and identifying the actors who have met those behaviors, which therefore should attract the incentives. The government, if you cut across all different schemes and legislation, the policy making has been more on universal. The policy making has been more on mandatory. So I think that's what I would expect. That's the principle of Indian lawmaking that I would expect to see in this scenario as well.
At this stage, though, would you say that the committee is looking to set up structures and not go into too many details, as you said, and that's something that you would ideally want to leave to the regulator to sort of take it?
Well, as I said, the committee was the committee that has been set up is to look at the act,
Right.
and act and thereby suggest amendments and suggest modifications to the act. The committee's role is not to kind of create a parallel act or to go out of its mandate and set out the codes of practice and codes of norms as well. So we are therefore our scope is to look at the act itself, look at all the different clauses that are there within the act, and then kind of just just nuance it a bit, so that there is cohesion, clarity, and then also red flag those areas where we see where we feel it's going to be worrisome. And in the end, it's the committee submits its report back to the House, saying that these are parts that we found okay, these are parts where we have modified for better cohesion, for better clarity, for better transparency, and these are the points where we could not could not reach consensus, and some members of the committee feel that these are red flags and these need to be discussed in greater detail.
Okay. And to the other panelists, anyone who wants to come in, if there are one or two things you would want the committee to keep in mind as they sort of go about this final deliberation, what would that be? Both from the perspective of personal data that they're looking at and also NPD that might be brought under its purview, although that's unclear at the moment.
Yeah, I think some of what we set out, sort of this focus on creating that institutional capacity and culture of like transparency and consultation. Because I mean, I just want to reiterate again, sort of the best way to probably do this, and I think Mr. Gogoi himself also alluded to this, is just gathering more information. There'll be sort of further scope for refinement and understanding what are the specific use cases, understanding those. Identifying the challenges. I think one of the points you yourself had mentioned, Rohit, earlier was, could we look at sort of government sharing of data a little more, this G2G or G2B data sharing? And I thought that could actually be a great starting point, because India already has an open data policy, the NDSAP. It's been around for several years, but the problem has been with the implementation. So perhaps it would be worthwhile even understanding those challenges that we faced in making public sector data available for reuse, capacity constraints within the ministry, interoperable tech architecture. Some of these suggestions could then be leveraged for boosting perhaps voluntary B2B sharing as well. So maybe creating that sort of structure which allows for this kind of consultation, this kind of evidence gathering might be useful.
In fact, it's great that you mentioned that, and to Mr. Gogoi as well. So actually, there's a lot of work that's been increasingly happening in making data platforms interoperable, right? And for instance, the National Digital Health Mission has been looking at sandboxes, etc., wherein through open APIs, a lot of data is made available to startups, etc., to then experiment and come up with solutions that really work. Maybe that's also a way to give the startups a leg up in terms of being able to access data and try different things out. In fact, Subhashish, since you guys have been working a lot in this space, is there something you would want to add?
Yeah, look, I think I do tend to agree with Mr. Gogoi that at the end of the day, any regulation, and again, if you go back to regulatory theory 101, every regulation is some form of state coercion, right? And for good or for bad.
Right.
To that extent, I think there is going to be a coercive element, but yes, those coercive elements should perhaps not be extremely prescriptive because of the costs that they impose. And whether it's happening through a very, very state-led program, or whether it's happening through a more industry-led program, which one might call the account aggregator system, I think what we will really benefit from, and therefore, to your question, my advice, if one may presume that much knowledge to the committee, would be to again just go back to all the work that was done under the FSLRC program many years ago. It's been about a decade since then, but there were hundreds and hundreds of comments that were received on how do you design good regulators. And given the uncertainty in the space, and given the potential risks to our digital economy involved, I think we need to go back to the basics. And the FSLRC is a very good document. A paper written by Ajay Shah, Justice Sri Krishna, and others gave 7 principles of good regulators, and we need to make sure that we incorporate them. So, for example, the purpose should be extremely clear. Very often what we say in our regulations is the purpose is to regulate, but that is a process, that is not the purpose. Whereas if you see the US, the way the US writes their regulatory laws, it is to say, here are the 5 metrics that you are trying to go after and trying to improve, right? So that is purpose, because then you can figure out, is the regulator doing its job or not? But if you say the regulator's job is to regulate, you never know if it's doing a good job. Similarly, executive functions, this regulator, the DPA and PDA, whatever we end up at, is going to have a lot of powers of search and seizure. How do we know that's going to be used in a way that is not disruptive towards businesses? How have other countries looked at it? Other countries have come up with detailed SOPs. These are your rights if you're under a rate. We do not necessarily, in most cases, Indian regulators do not come up with these SOPs. So the parent legislation should say that the DPA should come up with these SOPs before it goes forward and does it. The board of the DPA, the current proposal in front of the JPC, I believe, was that there are 5 members who are all essentially internal members of the DPA. How do you make sure the board has to be a majority non-executive board? It has to have a majority of independent members who are experts from the field, who are representatives of industry, civil society, human rights, whatever else. It has to be that kind of a board rather than a board that is dominated by internal members of that regulatory body. And finally, to say that the most important perhaps is essentially what happens in the regulator is that there is a legislative function that only a parliament or a state legislature is supposed to pay. In this case, you take small bits of it and give it out to either the department or to the regulator. But you have to make sure that those same processes that the deliberative processes that a parliament follows are also followed by that regulator, which means it should be mandated that every time a DPA brings a law related to either personal data or non-personal data, that it be preceded by a public consultation. In fact, 2 rounds of public consultation, that a cost-benefit paper should be put out in public domain before a certain thing is proposed. And these are all regulatory best practices that are being done globally, that have been studied a lot in India. And I think we would all benefit as a country if we really go back to all the great work that the FSLRC committee did and actually imbibe some of those in this piece.
Yeah. No, thank you so much for sharing that. And I think that's really useful. Ultimately, it's about how the institution is set up that is going to sort of define whatever else follows. Because anyways, this is such an evolving space. It's kind of hard to predict everything right away. And even the PDP bill took so long, bringing another thing back to Parliament is going to take a while. So it's better that the regulator does it through regulations, but then it's well tasked to sort of do it. Nadika, any comments from you, closing comments from you in terms of what you would want the committee to keep in mind as they finalize these of the leg of the report?
I think both Srinidhi and Subhashish have sort of said everything that I want to say, but I also add one point, and that again is something that we heard. There is this assumption with NPD is that communities and smaller organizations will always operate on a benevolent level, especially community trustees and so-called data trustees will operate on a benevolent level, and individual rights will be protected. Individual rights to data will be protected, and we see that may not happen, particularly, especially in this idea of this creating of this high-value data sets, where an individual cannot create it or access it, but only a certain data trustee is able to do that. And so, I think that's something that I want to reiterate here, and that. As we've already said, data exists on a spectrum from non-personal to personal, and it goes back and forth. And so these things are something that I think we should look at more and more when we come up with the framework to regulate this, and that organizations may not always act in the benevolent way that we think they will, given the framework and regulation.
Mr. Gogoi, any closing comments from you?
As I said, I think this is a legislation that will have very significant transition and compliance costs on the Indian industry, of which startups play a very important role, not only in terms of revenue, in terms of jobs, in terms of India's own global reputation as one of the startup hubs across the world. So we have to be very careful with the legislation and the ensuing institution that is created. And when I mean we, I mean we as a society, of which the Indian legislator is one part, one very important pillar, but nonetheless, the media, the civil society, the private sector, the judiciary, the executive itself, I think all of us have to be very watchful that this becomes an enabler and a facilitator. We have, and I'll be honest that Indian regulators or Indian laws or executive decisions have a hit or miss record when it comes to performance, when it comes to a compliance. Sometimes it is set out with the intention of being an enabler and being a facilitator, but the way it gets implemented or the way it gets designed, it becomes an obstacle. So we have to be extremely vigilant and extremely careful. I do understand that there is a strong role for judiciary for clarification and for grievance redressal. That is both the fortunate and the unfortunate part of the Indian policy making, because you want an empowered judiciary, but you also want the empowered legislator, because it's the people of India elect their legislator, they don't elect their judiciary. And therefore, when you curtail the powers of the legislator, you are somehow indirectly curtailing the power of people of India for supervision and of oversight. As I said, I think there was a previous suggestion made about making data public to Indian startups, and I think that there is value in that idea. I don't know what is the mechanism would work that would help the government of India reach that conclusion, reach that stage. Is it startups registered with Startup India with a particular scheme? There must be some form of MOU, some form of common platform for the government to work closer with startups. And lastly, again, there is going to be so much. I know that regulators in Europe have been flooded with cases after they have been set up, and therefore a single regulator in India will be flooded with so many cases of violations and procedure. So the volume is something to think about, and how do you decrease the burden on the Indian regulator as well. That needs to be thought about. There are individual members who think about having a national and a state regulator as well, with the intention of reducing the burden of procedure. and oversight on the central regulator. I don't know if that's the best idea, but we have to think from the DPA point of view as well. That how does the DPA become a vibrant institution? How do we ensure that it does not get overloaded, overburdened, and how it remains professional, modern, global, competitive, and how it is open to both scrutiny and it is accessible to the best talent. So there is a lot of work to be done. As I said, we've come a long way from having no law to having a landmark judgment, to having a draft bill. And I think where we can we have many stages to go in the coming years. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think all of us agree that regulating the vast amount of data that is being generated is a very difficult problem to solve. And as Subhashish also mentioned initially, that no matter where we start, there is going to be a lot of lessons to be learned. And it's also great to hear from you that already the committee is very mindful of the fact that the compliance burdens can be problematic for the economy, and there is need to sort of keep that in mind as we go ahead. I think for me, one of the key takeaways here would be that setting up a strong regulator and making sure that it follows transparent practices and sort of undertakes consultative processes is something that should be very important. And I think that will serve us well as we go ahead, no matter which framework we sort of decide to sort of adopt. And as I think you mentioned in the beginning, that it's great to hear that you're trying to be in sync globally to understand how things are happening in other countries, so that ultimately, data doesn't sort of abide by jurisdiction per se. There's a lot more exchange of information that happens now, and it'll be good if Indian laws are in sync with how things are happening globally as well, so that it doesn't increase costs. So I think with that, thank you so much, everyone. If there's anything somebody would want to add, please feel free. But for me, this has been a great discussion. Thank you so much for your time, and hopefully this will inform the debate as we kind of go ahead.